Welcome back, everyone. We're diving deep today, going way beyond those surface level headlines. We're tackling poverty, something that honestly feels like it shouldn't even be a thing in this day and age, right?
Yeah, it's perplexing.
We always hear those staggering numbers, millions living in poverty, but you helped me go beyond the numbers this time.
Absolutely.
You really dug into the research, pulled articles, podcast notes, and, all those resources paint this really complex picture.
Definitely.
And I think what's really important this time is we're going to focus on Gen Z and how poverty is hitting them differently.
It's crucial because,
Yeah.
each generation faces it in a unique way.
Right, right.
And for Gen Z, the economic landscape is it's just vastly different from what, say, the baby boomers faced.
Absolutely. And I think one of the things that really struck me when I was looking at those numbers, I mean, you hear things like over 600 million people living in extreme poverty globally. Or what was it? 37.9 million here in the US.
Right.
And it's easy to get numb to those numbers.
Absolutely.
But then I was reading through the World Bank research you sent, and their definition of extreme poverty is living on less than $2.15 a day.
Yeah.
Fine.
It's a stark reminder of the severity of the issue.
Yeah.
That $2.15 figure,
Yeah.
that's supposed to be just the bare minimum you need to survive,
To literally not starve.
to avoid starvation, to, prevent dying from diseases.
Right.
But it really doesn't even begin to reflect the depth of the challenges, that people are facing
Day to day.
daily just to get by. I mean, they might be getting enough calories to technically survive,
Right.
but what about basic health care,
Yeah.
clean water,
Education. All.
education?
Yeah.
That number barely scratches the surface.
Okay, so let's bring Gen Z into this conversation because it feels like they're entering adulthood with this whole other set of economic pressures.
For sure.
We keep hearing about skyrocketing housing costs, wages that just aren't keeping pace with inflation, student debt loads that are astronomical.
Mm-hmm. And that's exactly right. Every generation has its challenges, but for Gen Z, it really does feel like a perfect storm of economic factors
Yes.
that previous generations just didn't have to deal with to the same extent. And I think one thing that really illustrates this point was in one of the reports you shared. It said that 60% of Gen Z renters are afraid that rent increases are just going to outpace their ability to pay.
60%. That's
It's a
crazy.
huge number.
And that's got to create this underlying sense of anxiety all the time. How do you plan for the future when you don't even know if you can keep a roof over your head?
Right.
And then you see stats about only 15% of Gen Z thinking they'll ever own a home.
Oh, yeah.
And I guess the question is this just like a kids these days kind of thing? Or is there something fundamentally different happening with this generation?
It's tempting to dismiss it as just, generational griping. But the data really suggests something much deeper is going on.
Yeah.
And I think one of the key factors here is the widening gap between the rich and the poor. What we call income inequality.
Right.
For example, here in the U.S., the richest 10% earn over 13 times more than the poorest 10%.
That's such a huge disparity.
It's not just about, the concentration of wealth at the top.
Right.
It creates these systemic barriers, that make it much, much harder for people to move up that economic ladder.
So it's not just that the rich are getting richer.
Right.
It's that the poor are actually finding it harder to get ahead.
Yes, exactly.
Like they're stuck.
Imagine a ladder where, the rungs get further and further apart as you climb.
Wow. Yeah.
That's kind of a good way to think about income inequality.
Okay, I like that analogy.
For someone at the bottom, taking even one step up can feel impossible.
Yeah. And then you add in the concept of the welfare trap.
Yes.
Something you highlighted a lot in your notes, and it's something I've always found a little bit perplexing.
Yeah.
We have these programs designed to help people escape poverty,
Right.
but it often feels like they end up having the opposite effect.
Yeah. It's a complex issue for sure, but let me give you an example.
Mm-hmm.
Imagine someone's unemployed, they're receiving government assistance to cover their basic needs.
Okay.
And then finally, they find a job.
Yay.
But it's low paying.
Okay.
And it doesn't offer benefits like health insurance.
Right.
Now, because they're earning a small income, they lose some or even all of their government assistance.
So they're working, but they're not necessarily better off.
Exactly. That's the trap.
Wow.
That small income isn't enough to cover the costs they now have to face on their own.
Childcare.
Childcare, transportation,
Yeah.
all of that.
So they actually end up worse off financially, even though they're trying to improve their situation.
Exactly.
It's like getting punished for going to work.
It can feel that way. Like you're being penalized for trying to improve your situation.
And that's got to be so discouraging.
Absolutely.
It can make people hesitant to even try, right?
It discourages people from seeking employment or even like pursuing higher paying jobs because they're afraid of losing that safety net that's, keeping them afloat.
Yeah, I never thought of it that way.
It's a real catch-22. And it highlights, how important it is to think about the real world consequences when we design and implement these programs.
Because good intentions aren't always enough.
Right. It's not enough to just provide aid. We have to make sure that it's actually empowering people to improve their lives in a sustainable way.
Hmm.
We need to look at the big picture, how all these different factors like income inequality, the structure of our welfare programs, how they interact to create these traps. Okay, so I think with that foundation laid, let's turn our focus now to Gen Z and the unique challenges that they're facing within this, very complicated landscape.
Okay, let's do that. So we've talked about this backdrop of income inequality and how messed up the welfare system can be. But there's this whole other thing that happens when people talk about Gen Z, right? It's almost
Yeah.
like they're seen as lazy or entitled.
We have to acknowledge those stereotypes and really look at where they're coming from. But I think it's also important to recognize that this generation is dealing with some serious anxieties,
Yeah,
economic anxieties.
absolutely. And one of the big ones is this housing crisis.
Oh, yeah.
It feels like it's just impossible for young people to afford a decent place to live.
It's tough.
And I was looking at some of that research you sent. The comparisons are kind of shocking. I mean, baby boomers could buy a home with like 2 or 3 years of income, right?
Yeah, that was the norm,
But Gen Z is looking at 6 or 7 years,
at least.
at least. And in some cities, you mentioned Sydney,
Oh, yeah?
it's like 14 years of income.
It's unbelievable.
Yeah.
It highlights just how drastically things have changed.
To buy an average house, it's mind-blowing.
That ability to buy a home, it was a marker of adulthood. Achievable.
Right, right.
And now it's like this distant dream for so many.
Yeah, and we're seeing all these knock-on effects, right?
Oh, absolutely.
People delaying marriage, putting off kids. All because they can't find a decent place to live.
And all these alternative living situations popping up, tiny homes, co-living.
Right, trying to find solutions.
But those aren't always, they work for some people, but they're not a solution for everybody.
No, not at all.
And it really points to something bigger about economic security. What does it mean to be an adult these
This
days?
big question.
But, housing isn't the only thing. The job market seems pretty tough for Gen Z, too.
Yeah.
We're hearing about rising wages for young people, but is that really the full picture?
There has been some wage growth, yes, but it's important to remember where they're starting from. It's a much lower base than previous generations had.
Oh, okay, so they're still behind.
Even with those increases, they're playing catch-up in a market where everything is more expensive.
Everything costs more.
The cost of living just keeps going up.
Right.
And, we can't forget youth unemployment.
That's right.
Still a major issue.
In a lot of places. Yeah. And even when Gen Z finds jobs, they're often lacking that stability.
Ah, I see.
The benefits that earlier generations kind of took for granted, it's a lot of gig work.
Yeah, all those contract positions.
It creates this sense of precariousness. Will I have work next month? What happens if I get sick?
It's stressful.
Absolutely.
So it's not just about finding any job.
Yeah.
It's about finding a job that actually gives you some security.
Some kind of path forward. It's hard to think about the future when you're just trying to survive.
Yeah, just get through the week.
Exactly.
And then, of course, we have to talk about student debt.
Oh, it's a huge burden.
I mean, the cost of college, it's just skyrocketing.
It's crazy. And it leaves Gen Z saddled with all this debt.
Before they even really start their lives.
It impacts everything. Their ability to save, invest, buy a home, start a family.
It's a lot to carry.
Absolutely. And, it's no wonder they're starting to question the value of that traditional 4-year degree.
Yeah.
We see more young people looking at different paths, like trade schools or community colleges.
It makes sense. Get those practical skills.
Enter the workforce faster, maybe avoid some of that debt.
Yeah, it's like this trade-off they have to weigh.
Is a degree worth it?
With all that debt.
It's tough. Previous generations didn't really face this dilemma to the same extent.
So we've got income inequality, the welfare trap, this crazy housing crisis, a job market that's all over the place, and then student debt on top of it all.
It's a lot.
It paints a pretty bleak picture.
It's a difficult landscape for sure.
So where do we even start? With all these obstacles, is it even possible to, really solve the problem of poverty.
You've hit on a crucial point. These challenges are all interconnected.
Yeah.
They feed into each other. But there's another layer here, too. We have to look at how we define and measure poverty.
Okay, that's interesting.
Because the way we do that now,
Yeah.
it's actually part of the problem.
What do you mean by that?
Well, think about the official poverty measure in the U.S., developed in the 60s.
Wow, that's a long time ago.
It hasn't been significantly updated since.
Really?
And the problem is, it doesn't account for how much more expensive life is now.
Right, especially for like the basics.
Exactly. Childcare, healthcare, housing, transportation. It's like trying to use an outdated map to navigate a modern city.
You're going to get lost.
For sure. And that's what happens. That outdated formula means we underestimate how many people struggling.
Oh, wow.
Millions of people who need assistance don't qualify because of this outdated system.
I never realized that.
And it's not just a U.S. problem either.
Oh, I bet.
Global poverty brings its own complexities.
Oh, yeah, I can imagine.
Things like corruption, inefficiency, lack of coordination.
So what does that look like practically?
Imagine a leaky bucket.
Okay.
A lot of the resources meant for people in need, they never even reach them.
Because of the leaks.
Exactly. International aid, for example.
Right.
Huge administrative costs, mismanagement. Only a tiny fraction of that money actually gets to the people it's intended for.
That's so frustrating.
It's a big problem. So yeah, we've talked about challenges for Gen Z and for fighting poverty on a global scale, but what can we actually do about it? What are some solutions?
Okay, so we've outlined a lot of problems, but knowing the problems is just the first step, right?
It is.
So what are the solutions? What can we actually do to fix things?
Right.
In my reading, one thing I kept coming across was universal basic income.
UBI. Yeah.
UBI. It seems like this radical idea.
It is definitely getting a lot of attention.
Yeah. Is it really as transformative as some people say?
Well, it gets to the core of some of the stuff we've been talking about.
Okay.
Like that welfare trap, for example. The idea with UBI is to give everyone a guaranteed basic income,
No matter what.
regardless of their income or if they have a job or not.
So it's about giving people a safety net.
Yeah, so they can meet their basic needs without constantly being afraid of falling into poverty.
So it's not about replacing work then?
Not necessarily. It's more about supplementing income, making sure people can afford the essentials.
I see.
And this is where it gets interesting. One of the arguments for UBI is that it could actually boost entrepreneurship, help people be more innovative.
Oh, how so?
Well, think about it. If you have that basic income, you're less afraid of risk, right?
Yeah.
You might be more willing to start that business you've always wanted to, or, maybe take some classes, learn new skills.
That makes sense.
And that can have all sorts of positive ripple effects throughout the economy.
Yeah, I can see how it could be empowering.
Right.
But I also imagine there are people who are worried about it.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Like, what if people become dependent on it and just stop working altogether?
That's a valid concern.
Yeah.
But, there have been some pilot programs,
Oh, like where?
places like Finland, Kenya.
Oh, interesting.
And they've shown that UBI doesn't necessarily lead to people working less. Some people might work a little less. Maybe they choose to spend more time caring for family or pursuing personal interests, but others might actually work more.
Because they have that safety net.
Exactly. They have the stability to maybe go for those better paying jobs or, start that business.
So it's not about creating a society where nobody works.
Or not at all.
It's more about giving people more choices.
Yeah, more agency in their lives. And I think one thing that's important to remember is that UBI isn't just about handouts. It's about restructuring our whole social safety net.
Yeah, making it more adaptable.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So that it works for people in the modern world.
Right.
But, UBI is a long-term solution. It would require some big system-level changes. There are also some more immediate things we can do, more targeted approaches that are showing some really promising results.
Like what?
Well, we were talking about Give Directly earlier.
Yes.
They're a great example of how unconditional cash transfers, or UCTs, are making a difference.
I love what they're doing.
They're literally giving cash.
Just straight up cash.
No strings attached to people who are living in extreme poverty.
That's amazing.
And what's really powerful about that approach?
What?
It recognizes that people in poverty, they know what's best for themselves.
They know what they need.
Exactly. So rather than saying, you have to spend this money on this specific thing, it gives people the power to make their own choices, the choices that are best for their families and their communities.
So are there any studies about whether that actually works?
Yeah. And the results are pretty incredible, actually. Studies have shown that these cash transfers lead to Increased household income, obviously,
Mm.
but also things like better healthcare, kids staying in school longer, and it can even give a boost to local economies.
It's like you're investing in people directly.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And sometimes those simplest solutions are the most powerful.
Right. But we shouldn't forget about some of the more traditional approaches as well. Like, there's been a lot of talk in the US about raising the minimum wage.
Right.
Where does that fit into all of this?
Well, raising the minimum wage to a livable wage is absolutely essential if we're serious about tackling poverty.
Yeah.
Here in the U.S., the current federal minimum wage, it's just not enough for people to survive on, let alone get ahead.
They can barely afford rent, let alone anything else.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Increasing it would immediately impact millions of low-wage workers.
Lift them out of poverty
And it would also help the economy overall.
because they'd have more money to spend.
Exactly. When people have more money in their pockets, they spend it,
Yeah.
and that stimulates economic activity.
Makes sense.
But even with a higher minimum wage, there are still those gaps in our safety net, like we were talking about earlier.
Yeah, those things that need to be addressed.
Right. And I think our current welfare systems, they try to help, but they often create those barriers that we talked
Like
about.
the welfare trap.
Exactly. We need to look at how to redesign these systems so that they're more supportive, less focused on punishing people for trying to improve their situation. And one idea that's gaining some traction is a gradual phase out of benefits.
So what does that look like?
Instead of just cutting people off completely when they start earning a bit more money,
Great, which makes no sense.
you gradually reduce their benefits as their income rises.
Oh, I see.
That way they're not afraid of suddenly losing all their support.
Right, they're not falling off a cliff.
Exactly. It encourages people to work more and earn more, but without facing those financial penalties.
It gives them a chance to transition.
Exactly. And another crucial thing is making sure everyone has access to affordable childcare and healthcare.
That's a big one.
I mean, those are often huge obstacles for people who are trying to work, especially single parents or people with health issues.
Yeah. It's like it all comes down to basic needs, doesn't it?
It really does.
It feels like we've come full circle.
In a way, yes.
We started talking about Gen Z's struggles, but now we're talking about solutions that would help everyone.
You're absolutely right. Poverty is not an individual failing. It's a systemic issue.
It's a reflection of our society.
Exactly. And it's something we can change.
Mhm.
It requires this multifaceted approach,
Yeah.
tackling those root causes, not just the symptoms.
So as we wrap up here, what's the one thing you want our listeners to take away from this conversation?
I want them to understand that poverty is solvable. It's a complex problem, yes, but it's not impossible.
Okay.
We have the knowledge, we have the resources to create a world where everyone has the chance, not just to survive, but to
Right.
thrive.
I love that.
It starts with understanding how all these challenges are connected, being willing to try new and innovative solutions, and having the political will to actually make those big systemic changes.
I think that's such a powerful message. It's not about charity, it's about justice.
Absolutely.
It's about creating a world where everyone has a real opportunity for a good life. So I hope as you continue to think about this, you'll consider which of these solutions resonates most with you and why. What kind of world do you want to help build?